Давай, запускай. Шарманку. Що ви саме з Ані поговорювали по темах?
Ми говорили, що збитки, які несуть товаровиробники сьогодні через війну.
Через війну і через відключення електроенергії.
Це дуже в контексті, але у нас зараз це звільнені території, там жах просто, що робиться.
Якщо ми почнемо з того, що з загального питання, як ми входимо в зиму нормально, типу, до першого питання, і ви розкажете про всякі там підсумки, типу, що ми на собою станом сьогодні являємо, добре?
Today is 24th of November and it's straight 9 months from the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Russia in Ukraine. My name is Vasil Samokhvalov. Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform continues its operation. Our guest today is Denis Marchuk, Deputy Chair of the Ukrainian Agrarian Council. So the first question, how does the agrarian sector enters the winter season of 2022-2023? Well, the war corrects all the spheres of our life, including agrarian sector. Agrarian sector was a locomotive of Ukrainian economy, which accounted for 40% of the currency proceeds, and the way the agrarian sector operates now depends on the way the Ukrainian agrarian sector operates now depends the Ukrainian economy in general. We have good results with harvesting, and preliminary estimate is 55 million tons, which means under occupation is the index that can guarantee the food security of the country, because we consume about 20 million tons. So we see there is a huge potential for export and potential for currency proceeds. The sowing campaign for winter crops is almost over. We see the decrease of the areas, harvesting areas, due to occupation and due to the incapacitation of export, and about the harvesting areas decreased about 40%, and that there are huge hopes on the spring sowing campaign. The Istanbul Treaty is being extended, and we expect the export potential not to decrease shortly, so the proceeds from the export will keep coming, and these are the circumstances we have to reckon with today and plan respectively for 2023. Okay, so how will we enter the spring season? We have something harvested, something is being stored, something is being exported. So this mathematics or economy will tell us what we will sow in spring. In figures, what we harvested, what we exported, and what we have stored currently, and what will be the areas of what will be the harvesting areas in spring. Well, it's difficult to say now about the areas because our counteroffensive by our armed forces is pretty intense. We liberate significant areas, but they're still problematic because, for example, in Kharkiv and Kherson regions, the vast territories are mined. They could be planned for sowing campaign, but there should a colossal job be done in terms of demining. Ukrainian State Emergency Service works in an intense regime, but the efforts are still not enough, so we have to engage additional mechanisms additional demining teams, including our Western partners who can expedite the process. And if we make it, the number of sowing areas in spring will increase. And we have to also mention that mining is not the only problem, because large number of enterprises are physically destroyed, the material is destroyed, administrative buildings, the farms are destroyed, the direct and indirect losses are about $40 billion, indirect losses are $35 billion, and the direct losses are 6.6 billion, which means that it's very difficult to plan the sowing campaign for 2023. So I would rather say that the sowing campaign will happen, but to what scale and what crops will be used, we will only be able to talk about it during the preparation, maybe in February, when the agrarians will plan their sowing campaign directly. But taking into account the current weather conditions and the prices for corn, we are still unable to harvest it due to the weather conditions, and the low price cannot guarantee any proceeds without mentioning any additional income. We still see corn in the fields in many regions of Ukraine, and if we don't harvest it now, so no one will harvest, no one will sow it in spring, which will lead to negative aspect, because now the demand for corn is pretty high throughout the world, because it's one of the basic crops for cattle fodder, and even now the deficit is witnessed across the world. So we have to help to support the manufacturers in some way. Well, we understand the situation with harvest. What about poultry and cattle? Well, they are all end up in a difficult situation. The significant part of the cattle is physically destroyed, and during the last forum in Germany, we as a Ukrainian Agrarian Council, we introduced the Marshall Plan for support of Ukrainian agrarian sector to compensate the losses of the agrarian sector. As I mentioned, the dairy farms were destroyed, the poultry farms were destroyed, and the dairy cattle should be raised from scratch. And the conditions we end up in now, we have to support the farmers with veterinary medicines, with fodder, and to just keep them afloat, to provide them with generators. You see, the situation is complicated when we suffer strikes on the civilian infrastructure. In the same way, our agrarian enterprises suffer these strikes, and we have to resort to international funds to support our dairy cattle producers in these conditions, because we increased the export to European Union due to cancellation of quotas, and if we don't support these farms now in their production of extra class dairy products, it will lead to decay of the sector, because it's the added value we're talking about, is the jobs. We sell the dairy products and not only raw products, so we have to find funding, direct funding for the needs of the enterprises, as well as other types of support, like I mentioned, the veterinary medicines, diesel generators, and fodder. Any questions? Good afternoon, Anastasia Kravchenko, Ukrinform. I would like to just specify, you mentioned that no corn will be harvested. For the time being, it's only 40% of the planned harvest is gathered. In this year, the planned harvest was 30 million tons. It was a perspective figure, but what I mentioned, we gathered way less, and we'll see where we end up, which situation we end up in. And another question, you say that most likely the sowing of crops will be decreased. Will it influence the deficit of any products, any food products in the shops of Ukraine? Maybe there will be deficit in terms of crops or bread. No, it will not influence the food security of Ukraine, because all the crops that we're growing, we provide ourselves to the 100%. We are export-oriented country in terms of agrarian export. So the food security in both rye, corn, and wheat, and sunflower seeds for production of sunflower seeds oil. So one of the key factors that influence the capacity of Ukrainian families, it will grow from the next year, because we talk about different factors such as inflation, war, and the breakdown of logistic chains, and fuel prices, and correlation of hryvnia price to US dollar is one of the key problems for today is the energy carriers and the spending resulting in deficit of electric power. It all influences in incapacity of the Ukrainian farmers to get any currency proceeds under conditions of these power deficits, because the diesel price is about 52-54 hryvnias per liter, and 1 kilowatt takes half a liter, which means 25 hryvnias. Before the war, our 1 kilowatt of power costed about 5 hryvnias. So now it increased 5 times, that only due to the deficit of electric power. So these trends will develop in future, and it will shape the functioning of business in future, because whoever does not manufacture, they will just physically close and they will stop operating. Are today's export logistic chains, to what extent do they let us realize our export potential? What's the percentage that we can export? Thanks to the continuation of the sea corridors from Odessa, we have capacity of exporting about 60% of our export through sea corridors. There are land routes through railway, river ports, through the Danube River. They are engaged, and the agrarians keep looking for funding. European Council allocated more than €1 million for development of river routes, which provides us with the opportunity to develop other logistic chains apart from the sea corridor under conditions of Russian aggression. We can reach the ports in Poland, in Lithuania, and as of today, us as an association, we initiated the application to the government of Poland to build a broad railway in Ukraine to connect Ukraine with Lithuania, so we have access to the seaport in Klaipėda, which is the right decision, because it will profit both Ukraine and our European partners, since it may become a logistic hub which will function. How long will this take? It will take about 3 years, and it will cost about €12 billion. Another question about the draft law on export deposits. When the draft was registered in the parliament, there was a discussion about its withdrawal. Thank you. It's a very good question. For us, it's very important. Reckoning with the problems we listed, there is an artificial obstacle like export initiatives proposed by the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine so that the enterprise could plan their export activities. They have to enter into agreement which will have the enterprise to make a deposit in amount of 15% of the future proceeds. But if you can add, for example, $35 million, then you can not fix these operations, but keep exporting your products within 1 year. For example, only two traders in Ukraine are capable of doing that, so we limit the capacity of the small business sector in Ukraine. So we came up with another draft law, the one you mentioned, and the -1 that we proposed. So we have to fight the shadow economy in order not to leave the currency proceeds abroad Ukraine, but have them come to Ukraine. But we don't have to impede the operation of small businesses. We should create an overdraft which could give to an agrarian enterprise an option. For example, if you pay taxes within some amount, you can export your products within this specific amount of taxes paid. For example, you get your currency proceeds to Ukraine, and this is the amount within which you can export your products. It's a transparent mechanism which will enable all the participants of the market to have access to export and not to make it a monopolistic right to export. So thank you for this question. Last question, please. Michael Short, Newsweek magazine. What is the current situation with the grain storage? Due to destruction of the large number of grain silos, we could store about 15 million tons, but now this issue is being solved, for example, by alternative storage capacities. For example, thanks to our partners, United Nations, Japan, Canada, and World Food Program, we were able to procure a necessary number of sacks for Ukraine. For the manufacturers who produce grain from 10 to 15 hectares, one sack is capable of storing like 150 kilograms. So you have to sign up in the state register and get the certain number of these sacks to store your grain. It doesn't solve the issue completely, but we expect to increase our export potential thanks to our land routes and ports of Odessa. And maybe we will not need to store a huge amount of grain. So there is an alternative mechanism in place. It operates, and the direct mechanism is export, which will enable us to export the grain and not to store it in Ukraine, because it's very difficult under the conditions of permanent bombardments. The dryers are being burned out due to constant strikes. Everybody suffers losses and everybody ends up in a complicated situation. Well, let's finish because our next briefing is in 5 minutes. We will talk with Mr. Yuri Ignat, the spokesperson of the Air Force Command of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Joining us in this studio was Denis Marchuk, Deputy Chair of the Ukrainian Agrarian Council. Thank you. See you in a couple of minutes.